In the last lecture, you saw how to handle requests and how to read some data from the request, like for example, the URL and which HTTP method we used. Now we'll learn about different HTTP methods throughout the course, by the way. GET is the default method used if you just enter a URL into your browser. Let's now shrink this again. Let's quit the server. You always need to quit and restart if you edit it, because otherwise your changes will not be reflected, because the old process will still be running. And let's now also use that response object. Now we could log that with the console, but actually this does not hold any interesting data. Instead, we can use it to fill it with data we want to send back. We do this by calling res. And now what? There are a couple of methods we can use. For example, set header. This allows us to set a new header. For example, content dash type, and that is a default header which the browser knows and understands and accepts. And then as a second value here, as a second argument in set header, we set the value for this header key. And we can send this to, or set this to text HTML. Now what this will do is it will attach a header to our response where we basically pass some meta information saying that the type of the content which will also be part of the response is HTML. Now there is of course only a certain set of supported headers the browser understands. And after this lecture, you'll find another lecture with some link where you can learn which headers you can set. Now, you don't need to set that many, let me say that. And later we will even learn about a package that does this for us so that we don't have to set the content type on our own. But here I will set it. Now, one important thing is missing, of course, and that is the HTML code, right? Thus far I'm saying we have HTML code, but I'm not sending it. Now we do this by setting response, and now we can set write here. Write allows us to write some data to the response. And this basically works in chunks, you could say, or in multiple lines. This would be a good picture to look at this. You write multiple lines of response. For example, if we write HTML code like this, res write. And if this looks super strange now, it is. We'll learn about a way easier way of sending HTML later, no worries. So here I'm just sending HTML, and you can also put longer HTML in there. Of course, you could now have your head, where you set the title, my first page, like this. And you could put even more into that line, but to make it easier to read, I'll write a new line where I now have my body. So I'm basically writing a whole HTML document here in a very complex way. And there I'll just add a h1 tag saying hello from my NodeJS server. Okay, so this is now some HTML code, and it will be written to the response line by line. We now also need to tell Node once we're done with creating that response. And we do this by calling end. So after we set all the headers and wrote all the data to the response body, we call end, and now is the point where we must not write anymore. We can still call write, but this will result in an error because we must not change the response after we ended it, because this is basically the part where we will send it back to the client. Node.js will send it back to the client. So here it should send back a response with some HTML code inside of it, where we also tell the browser that it's HTML code. The browser wouldn't know otherwise. And with that, if we save that file, make sure you never forget to save your changes, and we re-execute it, we again have that running process. And now, if I reload my localhost 3000 page here, we see hello from my Node.js server. And if I open the Chrome developer tools here, which you can also do from the menu, I use the shortcut. You can also use view, developer, developer tools, or that shortcut you see here. Now, if you do that, let me reload. In the network tab here, you will see this request, this first request, and there you see headers, like for example in response headers. There you see my content type, which I set, right? This is the header we set here. And if we click on response itself to see the response body, we see that HTML document code we wrote. with the head section, with my first page, and so on. So this is now how we can send a response. We'll later also learn about a simpler way of doing that by using the Express.js framework. But it's super important that you understand all the nitty-gritty details that go on behind the scenes. And in this case, we simply understand it by writing all the nitty-gritty code on our own. This is how we can work with requests and send responses. Now let's connect both the request data we can get and the response data we can send.